Rachel Thompson, 34, small-town librarian and part-time genealogy researcher in Cedar Falls, Iowa. The smell of old paper and dust hit me like a punch to the gut as I pulled the manila envelope from the safety deposit box, my fingers trembling against the cold metal. 10 years I'd been searching for this document, 10 years of sleepless nights and dead-end leads, and now it sat in my hands like a loaded gun. The bank vault felt smaller than a coffin, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like angry wasps, and all I could think about was the look on my brother's face when he'd laughed at me in Dad's hospital room and said I deserved nothing. But Marcus had been wrong about a lot of things, and this yellowed piece of paper was about to prove it. Before I go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're hooked already, a like and subscribe will keep these stories coming. The document felt fragile between my fingers, like it might crumble if I breathed too hard. I'd found it 3 days ago in the most unlikely place, tucked inside a cookbook that belonged to my grandmother, a woman I'd barely known but who apparently knew more about family secrets than anyone realized. The recipe for apple pie had been written on one side, but when I'd held it up to the light in my tiny apartment above the library, I'd seen the watermark, official county seal, property deed, and there, in faded blue ink, my father's signature next to mine. Not Marcus's, mine. The safety deposit box had been Dad's final gift, the key hidden in his old tackle box, along with a note that simply said, "For Rachel, when she's ready to fight." I'd thought it was just sentimental nonsense when I'd found it last month while cleaning out the storage unit. Dad had always been one for dramatic gestures, especially after Mom died and left him raising 2 kids who couldn't have been more different. Marcus, the golden boy, star quarterback, business degree, the son who could do no wrong in Dad's eyes. And me, the quiet one who spent more time with books than people, who asked too many questions and never quite fit the mold of what a Thompson daughter should be. At least, that's what I'd always believed. I closed the envelope and walked out of the bank, the autumn air sharp against my cheeks. Cedar Falls looked the same as it had when I was growing up. Small houses with big porches, maple trees dropping their leaves like confetti, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Except they didn't know mine. They didn't know that for the past 10 years, I'd been living in a studio apartment above the library, working for barely enough money to pay rent, while my brother lived in Dad's house on the land that should have been half mine. The land he'd sold for $120,000 without telling me. The land that, according to the document in my envelope, had never been his to sell. My phone buzzed as I walked past the courthouse. A text from my friend Jenny at the county clerk's office. Court hearing moved up to tomorrow at 2 p.m. Marcus's lawyer filed a motion to dismiss. You sure about this? Ratch. I stopped walking, my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Was I sure? 10 years ago, when Marcus had stood over Dad's hospital bed and told me I was getting nothing, that Dad had left everything to him because I'd never been the kind of daughter who deserved it, I believed him. I'd been 24 and grieving and too shocked to fight back. I'd signed whatever papers he'd put in front of me, trusting that my big brother wouldn't lie to me about something so important. But trust was a luxury I couldn't afford anymore. I typed back, I'm sure. See you tomorrow. The walk home took me past the old Thompson property, or what used to be the Thompson property. Marcus had sold it to a development company that turned it into a strip mall. Where Dad's workshop used to stand, there was now a nail salon. Where Mom's garden had bloomed every spring, there was a parking lot. The sight of it still made my chest tight with anger and loss. I climbed the narrow stairs to my apartment, the smell of old books and coffee following me up. My place was small but comfortable, 1 room with a kitchenette, a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in, and walls lined with bookshelves. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first thing I'd ever owned that Marcus couldn't take away from me. I spread the deed out on my kitchen table, next to the stack of legal documents I'd been collecting for months. Property records, tax documents, witness statements from neighbors who remembered Dad talking about leaving the land to both his children. It had taken me years to piece together the truth, years of learning how to research and investigate and ask the right questions. Being a librarian had its advantages. The deed was dated 3 months before Dad died, when he was still lucid and clear-headed. His signature was shaky but unmistakable, and next to it, in his careful handwriting, were the words to my daughter Rachel Thompson, who has always been stronger than she knows. I traced the words with my finger, remembering the last conversation I'd had with Dad before the cancer took his ability to speak. He'd been trying to tell me something, his eyes urgent and frustrated, but I'd thought he was just confused from the medication. Now, I wondered if he'd been trying to warn me about Marcus, trying to tell me about the deed he'd hidden away. My phone rang, startling me out of my thoughts. Marcus's name flashed on the screen, and for a moment I considered not answering. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since I'd started asking questions about the property sale. "Hello, Marcus." "Rachel." His voice was tight, controlled. "I heard you've been talking to lawyers. News travels fast in a small town. What do you think you're doing?" There was an edge to his voice I'd never heard before, something that sounded almost like fear. "Dad left everything to me. You know that. You signed the papers." "I signed papers saying I wouldn't contest the will," I said carefully. "I never signed anything about the property deed." Silence on the other end. "Then what property deed?" "The one Dad filed 3 months before he died. The one that puts the land in my name." I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding. "The one you knew about when you sold it. You're crazy." But his voice cracked on the words. "There's no deed. Dad would have told me." "Would he? The same way he told you about the safety deposit box. The same way he told you about the key in his tackle box." Another silence, longer this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice was different, colder. "Stay away from the courthouse tomorrow. Rachel, you don't know what you're messing with." "Is that a threat?" "It's advice. From your big brother, who's trying to protect you." "Protect me from what?" But the line was already dead. I set the phone down with shaking hands, my mind racing. Marcus's reaction told me everything I needed to know. He'd known about the deed all along. He'd known, and he'd sold the property anyway, probably thinking I'd never find out. Probably thinking his quiet little sister would never have the courage to fight back. He'd been wrong about that too. I made myself a cup of tea and sat back down at the table, staring at the deed, until the words blurred together. Tomorrow I would walk into that courthouse and face my brother in front of a judge. Tomorrow I would finally get the justice Dad had wanted me to have. But as I sat there in my small apartment, listening to the wind rattle the windows, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marcus's warning had been about more than just a property dispute. There was something else, something I was missing. I was reaching for my laptop to do more research when I heard footsteps on the stairs outside my door. Heavy footsteps, moving slowly, deliberately. I lived alone above the library, and it was after hours. No one should have been in the building. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, waiting. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold, the soft scrape of metal against metal, like someone trying to pick the lock. Someone was trying to break into my apartment, and I had a terrible feeling I knew who had sent them. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking bones, and I grabbed the deed from the table, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood as I backed toward the bathroom. The smell of cigarettes and cheap cologne drifted through the crack under my door, mixing with the familiar scent of old books that usually comforted me. Now it felt like a trap. I pressed myself against the bathroom wall, clutching the deed to my chest, and listened to heavy boots moving through my apartment. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. Drawers opened and slammed shut. Papers scattered across the floor. The sound of my bookshelf being overturned made me bite my lip to keep from crying out. "Where is it?" a rough voice muttered. "Has to be here somewhere." My phone was on the kitchen table, 15 feet away, and completely unreachable. The bathroom window was too small to climb through, and the only other exit was past whoever was destroying my home. I closed my eyes and tried to remember everything Dad had taught me about being strong when I was scared. The footsteps moved closer to the bathroom door. I looked around desperately and saw it, the loose floorboard under the sink that I'd been meaning to fix for months. I pried it up with my fingernails, ignoring the splinters, and slipped the deed into the space beneath. If they found me, at least they wouldn't find what they were looking for. The door handle turned. Well, little Rachel Thompson. The man standing in my doorway was tall and thin, with graying hair and cold blue eyes. I'd never seen him before, but something about his face seemed familiar. He wore an expensive suit that looked out of place in my tiny apartment, and his smile made my skin crawl. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Someone who's very interested in what you found in that safety deposit box." He stepped into the bathroom, forcing me back against the sink. "Your brother said you might be reasonable, that you might be willing to make a deal. Marcus sent you?" "Marcus is trying to protect his family. You should listen to him." The man's eyes swept over the small bathroom, looking for hiding places. "Where's the deed? Rachel?" "I don't know what you're talking about." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We both know that's not true. You've been asking questions, digging around in old records. You found something that doesn't belong to you. It has my name on it. How does that not belong to me? Because some things are bigger than names on paper." He moved closer, and I could smell the cigarettes on his breath. "Some things are about family loyalty, about keeping secrets that need to stay buried." "What secrets?" But before he could answer, we both heard it, sirens in the distance, getting closer. The man's face changed, the fake friendliness disappearing. "This isn't over," he said. "You have 24 hours to forget what you found. After that, things get complicated." He pushed past me and walked quickly through my destroyed apartment. I heard the front door slam, then the sound of footsteps running down the stairs. By the time I worked up the courage to leave the bathroom, he was gone. The sirens were louder now, and I realized someone must have called the police about the break-in. Probably Mrs. Chun from the flower shop next door. She was always watching the street from her window. I pulled the deed from its hiding place and sat down heavily on my overturned couch, trying to process what had just happened. Marcus had sent someone to steal the deed. My own brother had sent a stranger to break into my home and threaten me. The realization hit me like a physical blow, making it hard to breathe. But why? What was so important about this piece of land that Marcus would go to such lengths to keep me from claiming it? The police arrived 10 minutes later, 2 officers who looked barely old enough to drive, let alone investigate a crime. They took pictures of the damage and asked questions I couldn't really answer. How could I tell them that my brother had probably orchestrated the whole thing? How could I explain about the deed without sounding crazy? Any idea what they were looking for? Officer Martinez asked, flipping through his notepad. "I'm a librarian," I said. "I don't have anything valuable." It wasn't exactly a lie. The deed was valuable to me, but I doubted anyone else would understand why. After the police left, I spent the rest of the night cleaning up the mess and trying to make sense of what the intruder had said. Family loyalty, secrets that needed to stay buried. What did any of that have to do with a piece of farmland in Iowa? I made coffee as the sun came up, my hands still shaking from the night before. The courthouse hearing was in 8 hours, and I still had no idea what I was walking into. But one thing was clear: Marcus was more desperate to keep this quiet than I'd realized, which meant the deed was more important than I'd thought. I spent the morning at the library, using my access to historical records and newspaper archives to research the Thompson property. What I found made my blood run cold. The land hadn't always been farmland. In the 1940s, it had been the site of a small aircraft manufacturing plant that produced parts for the military during World War II. The plant had closed in 1947 after a series of accidents, and the land had been sold to my grandfather for almost nothing. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was what I found in a 1963 newspaper article buried deep in the archives. A small story about environmental testing done on former industrial sites. The Thompson property had been tested for contamination and found to contain high levels of toxic chemicals in the soil. The article mentioned that cleanup would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, but then the story just stopped. No follow-up articles. No mention of cleanup efforts, like someone had made the problem disappear. I printed out the article and several others, my mind racing. If the land was contaminated, that would explain why Marcus had been so eager to sell it. But it didn't explain why he'd hidden the deed from me, or why someone had broken into my apartment to steal it. Unless I pulled up the property records for the strip mall that now sat on the old Thompson land. The development company that had bought it from Marcus was called Riverside Holdings. I'd never heard of them, but a quick search revealed that they specialized in environmental cleanup and redevelopment. They knew about the contamination. They'd bought the land specifically because it was contaminated, probably planning to get government contracts to clean it up. Contracts that could be worth millions of dollars. And Marcus had sold it to them for $120,000. Either my brother was the worst negotiator in history, or he'd been paid to keep quiet about something much bigger than a simple land sale. I was still staring at the computer screen when Jenny appeared at my desk, her face pale with worry. "Rachel, you need to see this." She handed me a legal document, her hands shaking. Marcus's lawyer just filed this with the court. I read the first few lines and felt the world tilt sideways. It was a motion claiming that I was mentally unstable, that I'd been harassing Marcus and making false claims about property that didn't belong to me. It requested that I be barred from the courthouse and subjected to a psychiatric evaluation. "He's trying to have me declared incompetent," I whispered. "There's more." Jenny's voice was barely audible. "He's claiming that you stole documents from the county clerk's office, that the deed is a forgery." I looked up at her, seeing my own fear reflected in her eyes. "Jenny, I need you to do something for me. I need you to make copies of everything. The deed, the newspaper articles, all of it. Hide them somewhere safe." "Rachel, what's going on? This is more than just a property dispute." "I know, and I think Marcus knows I know." I stood up, gathering the documents. "If something happens to me—" "Don't talk like that." "If something happens to me," I continued, "make sure these get to the FBI. There's something bigger going on here, something that goes back decades." Jenny nodded, tears in her eyes. "Be careful, Rach. Please." I left the library and walked toward the courthouse, the autumn wind cutting through my jacket like a knife. The hearing was in 2 hours, and I still didn't have all the answers. But I had enough to know that Marcus wasn't just trying to cheat me out of my inheritance. He was trying to cover up a crime that had been hidden for 60 years. The courthouse steps were slippery with fallen leaves, and I had to grip the railing to keep from falling. As I reached the top, I saw him, Marcus, standing by the entrance with his lawyer and 2 other men I didn't recognize. He looked older than I remembered, his face drawn and tired. When he saw me His expression hardened. Rachel. He stepped forward, blocking my path. I was hoping you'd come to your senses. I have come to my senses. That's the problem. You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't just about money. I know. It's about justice. It's about Dad and what he really wanted. I pulled the deed from my bag, holding it up so he could see it. It's about the truth. Marcus's face went white. Where did you get that? Dad left it for me, along with a message. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. He knew what you were planning, Marcus. He knew you'd try to steal everything from me. I wasn't stealing anything. I was protecting you. From what? He looked around nervously, then grabbed my arm. From people who don't care about family loyalty. From people who will do anything to keep their secrets buried. What secrets, Marcus? What are you so afraid of? But before he could answer, one of the men standing with his lawyer stepped forward. It was the same man who had broken into my apartment, and his smile was just as cold in the daylight. Miss Thompson, he said pleasantly, I believe we have some unfinished business. That's when I realized that the courthouse hearing had been a trap all along, and I had walked right into it. The man's hand closed around my wrist like a steel trap, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave bruises. The courthouse steps suddenly felt like a stage, with Marcus and his lawyer and this stranger all watching me like I was the star of a show I'd never auditioned for. The smell of wet leaves and car exhaust mixed with my own fierce sweat, and I could taste copper in my mouth, where I'd bitten my tongue. Let go of me, I said, loud enough for the people walking past to hear. A few turned to look, and the man's grip loosened slightly. We're just going to have a conversation, he said, smoothly, about that document you're carrying. In a public courthouse, with witnesses. I pulled my arm free and stepped back, clutching the deed against my chest. I'm not going anywhere with you. Marcus moved between us, his face pale and sweaty despite the cool air. Rachel, please, just listen to what Mr. Garrett has to say. Mr. Garrett? I stared at my brother. You're on a first-name basis with the man who broke into my apartment. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. I told him you'd be reasonable, that we could work something out. Marcus's voice cracked. I never wanted you to get hurt, but you were fine with me getting cheated. You don't understand. Then explain it to me. The words exploded out of me, 10 years of anger and hurt and confusion finally breaking free. Explain why you lied about Dad's will. Explain why you sold land that wasn't yours to sell. Explain why you sent this man to threaten me in my own home. People were definitely staring now. A small crowd gathering on the courthouse steps. Mr. Garrett looked uncomfortable with the attention, his cold smile slipping. Perhaps we should take this inside, he suggested. No, I backed toward the courthouse doors, keeping my eyes on both men. We're going to settle this right here, right now, in front of a judge. The way Dad wanted. I turned and walked quickly through the doors, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it over the echo of my footsteps in the marble hallway. Behind me, I heard Marcus calling my name, but I didn't stop. I had to get to the courtroom, had to get this deed in front of a judge before they could stop me. The hearing was in courtroom 3, and I could see the door at the end of the hallway. I was almost there when someone grabbed my shoulder and spun me around. It was Marcus, and his face was desperate. Rachel, stop. You have no idea what you're walking into. I'm walking into a courtroom to claim what's rightfully mine. It's not about the money. He was shouting now, his composure completely gone. It was never about the money. Dad didn't leave you that land to help you. He left it to destroy you. The words hit me like a slap. What are you talking about? Marcus looked around the hallway, then pulled me into an empty conference room. His hands were shaking as he closed the door behind us. Dad knew about the contamination, he said quietly. He'd known for decades. The government paid him to keep quiet about it, paid him to let them bury the evidence. That's how he afforded to send us both to college. How he kept the farm running when everyone else was going bankrupt. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Dad took money to cover up environmental contamination. It was the Cold War, Rachel. The plant was making parts for military aircraft. When they found out the chemicals were leaking into the groundwater, they couldn't let it become public. It would have been a national security issue. So they paid Dad to keep quiet. They paid him, and they promised that when he died, the land would be quietly transferred to the government for cleanup. No one would ever know what had happened there. Marcus sat down heavily in one of the conference room chairs. But then Dad got sick, and he started feeling guilty. He started talking about leaving the land to you, about making things right. And you couldn't let that happen. I was trying to protect you. Marcus's voice broke. Don't you see? If you'd inherited that land, you would have inherited the liability too. The cleanup costs, the lawsuits from people whose wells were contaminated, it would have bankrupted you. It would have destroyed your life. I felt like the floor was shifting under my feet. So you sold it to Riverside Holdings. They're a front company, government contractors who specialize in cleaning up messes like this. Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I sold it to them for a fraction of what it was worth because I knew they'd handle the cleanup quietly. No publicity, no investigations, no one asking questions about why Dad kept quiet for 60 years. And the $120,000, I put it in a trust fund for you. You were supposed to get it when you turned 35, along with a letter explaining everything. He pulled a folded envelope from his jacket pocket. I've been carrying this around for 10 years, waiting for the right time to give it to you. I took the envelope with trembling hands. My name was written on the front in Dad's careful handwriting, and it was sealed with wax. Inside, I could feel the weight of papers, of explanations I'd been waiting a decade to hear. Why didn't you just tell me the truth? Because I was 28 and scared, and I thought I was doing the right thing. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper, because Dad made me promise to protect you from this, and I thought keeping you away from the land was the only way to do that. I opened the envelope and pulled out the letter. Dad's handwriting was shaky but clear, and as I read, I felt my anger slowly transforming into something else. Sadness, understanding, and a deep, aching love for a father who had made impossible choices to protect his family. The letter explained everything Marcus had told me, but in Dad's own words. How the government had approached him in 1963, how they'd offered him money to keep quiet about the contamination, how he'd taken it because he was desperate to provide for his children, how he'd regretted it every day since, but felt trapped by the promises he'd made. And, at the end, an apology to me for leaving me a burden I shouldn't have to carry, to Marcus for asking him to lie, to both of us for not being brave enough to tell the truth while he was alive. He loved us, I whispered. He loved us enough to make a deal with the devil to keep us safe. Marcus was crying now, tears streaming down his face. And I loved you enough to honor that deal, even if it meant you'd hate me forever. I looked at my brother, really looked at him, and saw not the golden boy who had stolen my inheritance, but a scared young man who had been carrying an impossible secret for 10 years, who had sacrificed his relationship with his sister to protect her from a truth that could have destroyed her life. The deed, I said slowly. If Dad really wanted to protect me from the land, why did he leave me a deed? Marcus's face went pale. What do you mean? The deed I found. It's dated 3 months before Dad died, and it puts the land in my name. I pulled it from my bag, studying it more carefully. But if he knew about the contamination, if he was trying to protect me from it, why would he? I stopped, my blood running cold. The deed was real, but as I looked at it now, I could see something I'd missed before. The signature wasn't just Dad's. There was another name at the bottom, in smaller print. A witness signature. Mr. Garrett. Marcus, I said quietly. Who exactly is Mr. Garrett? He works for the government. He's been handling the Thompson property situation since Dad died. Marcus frowned. Why? Because he witnessed this deed, which means he knew Dad was planning to leave me the land. I stood up, my mind racing, which means the government knew too. That's impossible. The whole point was to keep the land away from you. Unless that was never the point at all. I was pacing now, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Marcus, what if Dad didn't leave me this land to burden me? What if he left it to me because he knew I'd fight for the truth? What are you talking about? I'm a researcher. I dig into things. I ask questions. I don't give up until I find answers. I stopped pacing and looked at my brother. What if Dad knew that giving me this land would eventually lead me to uncover the whole conspiracy? What if he wanted me to expose what the government did? Marcus stared at me, his face white. You think Dad was setting up the government? I think Dad spent 60 years feeling guilty about taking their money, and in the end, he decided to do the right thing. I folded the deed carefully and put it back in my bag. I think he left me this land knowing I'd eventually figure out the truth and make it public. Rachel, if you're right, then Mr. Garrett isn't here to help us. He's here to stop you. As if summoned by our conversation, there was a knock on the conference room door. It opened before either of us could respond, and Mr. Garrett stepped inside, his cold smile back in place. I'm sorry to interrupt, he said pleasantly, but I believe we have some business to conclude. Behind him stood two other men in dark suits, and I noticed that one of them had his hand inside his jacket. The conference room suddenly felt very small and very far from help. The hearing's been postponed, Mr. Garrett continued. Indefinitely. It seems there were some questions about the authenticity of certain documents. The deed is real, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, I'm sure it is. Your father was always very thorough. Mr. Garrett stepped closer, and I could smell cigarettes and something else, something chemical and sharp. But real doesn't always mean legal, and legal doesn't always mean wise. What do you want? I want you to forget you ever found that deed. I want you to go back to your quiet life as a librarian and stop asking questions about things that don't concern you. His smile never wavered. In return, you get to keep living that quiet life. The threat was clear, and I felt Marcus tense beside me. But instead of fear, I felt something else rising in my chest. Anger. The same anger that had driven me to spend 10 years searching for the truth. No, I said. Mr. Garrett's smile faltered. I'm sorry. I said no. I'm not going to forget, and I'm not going to stop asking questions. I pulled out my phone and held it up. In fact, I'm going to start asking them right now, starting with why a government agent is threatening a citizen in a public courthouse. Miss Thompson, I don't think you understand. I understand perfectly. You've been covering up environmental contamination for 60 years. You paid my father to keep quiet, and now you're trying to silence me. I started recording on my phone. But here's the thing about librarians, Mr. Garrett. We're really good at preserving information. That's when everything went wrong. One of the men behind Mr. Garrett lunged forward, reaching for my phone. Marcus stepped between us, and suddenly the small conference room erupted into chaos. Chairs overturned, papers scattered, and I heard the sound of fists hitting flesh. Run! Marcus shouted, blood streaming from his nose. Rachel, run! I ran. I burst out of the conference room and sprinted down the courthouse hallway, my footsteps echoing off the marble walls. Behind me, I could hear shouting and the sound of pursuit. I had to get to the courtroom, had to get in front of a judge, had to make this public before they could stop me. The courtroom doors were just ahead when someone tackled me from behind. I hit the marble floor hard, my phone skittering away across the polished stone. Strong hands grabbed my arms, hauling me to my feet, and I found myself face to face with Mr. Garrett. His pleasant mask was completely gone now, replaced by something cold and dangerous. "You should have taken the deal," he said. That's when the courthouse doors burst open, and a dozen FBI agents flooded into the hallway, weapons drawn. Federal agents. Nobody move. Mr. Garrett's hands released me so quickly I almost fell again. Around us, his men were raising their hands, their faces shocked and confused. In the chaos, I saw Marcus stumbling out of the conference room, his face bloody but his eyes bright with something that looked like hope. "Agent Sarah Chen, FBI," said a woman in a dark suit, stepping forward with her badge raised. "We've been investigating government corruption related to environmental cover-ups. Miss Thompson, we believe you have information that could help our case." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "How did you?" "Your friend, Jenny, called us this morning. She said you'd uncovered evidence of a decades-old conspiracy." Agent Chen smiled. "Turns out we've been looking for that evidence for a very long time." As the FBI agents led Mr. Garrett and his men away in handcuffs, I sat on a courthouse bench with Marcus, both of us trying to process what had just happened. The deed was safe in Agent Chen's hands, along with all the other documents I'd collected. The truth was finally going to come out. Dad would be proud, Marcus said quietly. He would be proud of both of us. I took his hand, feeling the weight of 10 years of anger and misunderstanding finally lifting from my shoulders. We both did what we thought was right, even if it took us 10 years to figure out what that was. I laughed, surprising myself. Better late than never. 6 months later, I stood in the same courthouse, but this time it was for a very different kind of hearing. The government had agreed to a settlement, full cleanup of the contaminated land, compensation for affected families, and a public apology for 60 years of cover-ups. The $120,000 Marcus had received for the land was just the beginning. The final settlement was worth over $10 million, money that would go toward environmental restoration and community health programs. Marcus and I split it equally, just like Dad had always intended. But more than the money, we'd gotten something else back. Each other. The trust that had been broken 10 years ago was slowly rebuilding, one honest conversation at a time. As we walked down the courthouse steps together, I thought about Dad's letter, about the impossible choices he'd made, and the courage it had taken to finally do the right thing. He'd known that leaving me the deed would eventually lead to this moment, not just justice for our family, but justice for everyone who had been affected by the government's lies. "So what now?" Marcus asked. "Now we go home," I said, "and we start over." The autumn air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of winter. But for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid of what the future might bring. Because sometimes the truth really does set you free. And sometimes the family that breaks your heart is the same family that helps you heal it.